allow him to study under him. So two conditions. First is has to go to Pandit's house before 4 o'clock in the morning. And the second condition is he will not enter in the uh, house of the Pandit. Okay. The Pandit has a veranda. The Pandit will sit inside the veranda. Sir William Jones will sit outside on the road. And this is how Pandit will teach him Sanskrit. And he accepted both the conditions and studied Sanskrit. And then he made a presentation in the American Philological Society, where he made this very important remark, and which is considered to be the beginning of comparative and historical linguistics. He said that uh, Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin must have the common ancestor, that these three languages must have come from the same source. Okay. So people have worked in comparative linguistics, uh, and they they tried to establish a language based on the kind of data they have. So they tried to find out the proto language. Okay. And such called comparatively established language is called Proto-Indo-European, the language based on Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit. Okay. So it is called that Proto-Indo-European is the mother language of these languages, and Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit are the sister languages coming from that mother. So comparative linguistics is a branch of historical linguistics that is concerned with comparing languages to establish their historical relatedness. How these languages are historically related. So that is done through comparative method. Okay, like how Gujarati and Hindi are related, or how Gujarati and Malvi are related. What are the similarities? What are the differences? And if these are the differences, then how those differences come into action. So all these things are done under comparative linguistics. It investigates similarities and differences between languages. It tries to identify the source, that is the proto-language, from which the other languages have derived, from which the language have descended. Maintains Comparative linguistics maintains a clear distinction between attested and reconstructed form. Attested form is a form of a language which is used as a data to come to some better what we call proto language. And reconstructed form is based on data of different languages. Okay. You hypothesize one language. Okay. There is next slide where I'll give you the example. Now this proto language or the reconstructed form of the language is marked with an asterisk before it. So that asterisk means that the form is reconstructed, not real. And group of languages into various language families. But there are different languages, so how they are related based on their relatedness, we make the language families. So, like majority of the Indian languages, our languages specifically Gujarati, Hindi, Marathi, Punjabi, these are called Aryan languages, while the South Indian languages like Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, they are called Dravidian languages. So these are the language families. In India only, there are four different language families. The second related discipline is called historical linguistics. It is a scientific study of language change over the time, that how language changes, how sounds change, how words change, how the meaning of the words change, how the sentence structure was changed. So there is a very interesting example that English was a subject object verb language, like Gujarati is. The first is subject, then there is an object, and then there is a verb. But because of these certain processes in English language itself, now English has become subject verb object language. Okay. And it has become the fixed word order. English also had cases like we have in Gujarati and Hindi, but now these cases are available only on some pronouns. The other cases are removed. and instead of that, you use the function words. So these changes are studied under historical linguistics. It tries to develop various theories about how and why language change. So what are the motivations for the language change? So those theories are developed in historical linguistics. It describes the history of speech community. Speech community, we will talk about it later also, is a group of people who use the same language variety. So what are the changes and how, what is the history of a specific speech community is studied under historical linguistics. And something that of our interest, that etymology, history of the words are studied under historical linguistics. Here there is an example, next slide. Uh, so there are examples from Old English, German, Latin, Greek, Russian, Sanskrit, Spanish, and French. These examples are nothing but numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 100. So in Old English, it was an. In German, it is eins. In Latin, it is unus. In Greek, it is hais. In Russian, it is odin. In Sanskrit, it is ekas. In Spanish, it is uno. In French, it is un. So based on these languages, there is the comparative from the top line in orange color. Okay, there is an asterisk before this. The next slide, please. Yes, this slide. So these, the straight lines, we have Old English, German, and on top there is this uh, orange line where the reconstructed forms are given. So based on these examples from these different languages, the reconstructed form of Proto-Indo-European is oinos for one, dvo for two. So like in Sanskrit, we say dvau, dvo. In Greek, we say duo. In Latin, we say duo. So it is reconstructed that in the original language from which these languages are descended, the word must be dwo, D-W-O. So this kind of work is done under historical and comparative linguistics. You can refer to these examples. Now, what is the authenticity? So there was a language called Hittite. It was reconstructed, and later on, there were sources made available by archaeological sites where the actual Hittite language was written. So there was very much similarity between the reconstructed form and the original Hittite. Okay. So it shows that this kind of scientific reconstruction has near similarity with the original language. So this was the uh, second school of linguistics, historical and comparative linguistics. But in order to do this kind of research, you need to have knowledge of at least one classical language, that is either Greek or Sanskrit or Latin. If we are working in our field, if you are working in the other areas, then you should know the classical Hebrew or classical Arabic. Fine. So for historical comparative linguistics, the knowledge of classical language is must. Next, the most important turn in the what we call study of linguistics, it is called the Saussurean turn, and that turn is called structural linguistics. Now, this is also a very good story. You can see the picture of Ferdinand de Saussure. He is considered to be the father of modern linguistics. Now, for him, the language is a structure, and we have to identify various rules governing the structure. So, for him, the concept of language is nothing but a structure. If you want to study the language, you will have to study the structure. You will have to identify various structures within the structure of language. And you will have to identify that how variation in the structure changes the meaning. Now here, Saussure never wrote a book which made him famous. Saussure died in 1914 and he started his course in general linguistics in 1908. There were around 4 to 5 courses that he has given. Saussure was also Sanskrit scholar. Saussure was also what we call philologist, and he was also working in comparative field. But Saussure somewhere realized that what we are doing in diachronic perspective, that is in the time frame, in historical frame, is not enough, and it is not right way to study the language which we use. So we will have to study the language in its present time, how it is being used. So that's why he developed a synchronic axis, and he developed a method of synchronic axis, which is called structural method, and he started giving course to his students. But before he actually theoretically presented in a book, he died at a very young age. Now what happens, his students who have attended the courses, they collected their lecture notes, whatever notes they have made during their lectures, and they found out the Saussure's lecture notes, the notes that he has prepared to teach. And by combining all these notes, they developed a book out of it. And the book is called Course in Modern Linguistics. It is written in French and published in 1916. And it was first translated into English somewhere in 1922. And that book brought a drastic change in the very idea of what language is and how we study language. So the first thing that I've already said, synchronic study of the language. What is language right now? That kind of study is called synchronic study. Okay. I have given a diagram on the previous slide. Yes. So today, the study of language today is synchronic axis. Study of language in terms of time. That in 449, what was this language? In 1066, what was the language? And how it changes. That kind of study is called diachronic axis. So this is his first and most important contribution, that we start studying language in its today's form. A diachronic approach considers the development and evolution of a language through history. A synchronic approach considers a language at a moment in time without taking its history into account. Synchronic linguistics aims at describing language at a specific point of time, usually the present time. Suppose you want to study Gujarati language or Hindi language that you are using. Then you collect the data of you and people speaking that language around you, and you develop a grammar from it. So that kind of study is called the synchronic analysis of the language. So this is the most important turn, because everybody before Saussure talked about only history of the language. Then second important aspect that Saussure talked about is the concept of langue and parole. These are French words. For Saussure, the object of linguistic study is langue, the underlying rules for linguistic behavior. However, in order to study langue, one has to depend on the data of parole. Now, this is very interesting difference. So Saussure believed that there is a system in our mind. There is something existing, or we acquire that system. So that system has all the rules of the language that we are using. So that system, the language system, Saussure calls langue. It encompasses the abstract systemic rules and convention of a signifying system. It is independent and pre-exist individual users. Means even before you start acquiring the language, say your mother tongue, those systemic rules are already there, maybe in the minds of your parents or in the people around you who are speaking that language. So based on their system, you also acquire that system. Lang involves the principles of language without which no meaningful utterance, that is parole, would be possible. So parole is actual speech, how we use the language. Lang is the system of rules which are there in our mind, which are collective. Everyone who is using that language, all of them have those rules. But parole is your individual speech, how you use it. Now, here the difference means Lang is internal, it is arrangement, and it is a relationship of rules understood by a social group, the entire group who is using that language. However, rarely thought of in everyday life. Those rules are there, but we don't think about it. When you use your mother tongue, let's say we use Gujarati, we don't think about the rules. We feel, oh yes, it is right, and we speak it. The way we think about the rules in English, because we have studied English, we have studied the rules of English. But for Gujarati, for our mother tongue, we have acquired those rules. They are already there. You don't have to think about it. And when you speak, the other person who knows the Gujarati language or whatever language that you are speaking, that person will understand. So that person also had that system. On the other hand, parole refers to the concrete instances of the use of language. That the moment you use those rules and you put into action, like you speak, so that is your parole. This is the individual personal phenomena of language as a series of speech acts made by a linguistic subject. I am a linguistic subject, I am a speaker. So I'm making certain utterances. This is my parole. This parole is based on my understanding of English language. Now you are as a listener, you also have that system of English language in your mind. And that's why you can understand my speech. You can understand the message that I'm conveying. So use of lang in some concrete situation is parole. Lang is abstract. We haven't seen it. Parole is concrete. We listen to it. Now, the Saussure's second important advice here is we have to study the system, not the speech. That is, we have to find out the rules which are part of that system. How do we do that? So in order to do that, you will have to collect the data of the speech, and you need a big amount of data, and from that data, you decipher the rules. So this is how you create a lang. You create the rules for the linguistic study. Now, these are the two important aspects of Saussure's idea of language. Before that, whoever used to study, they study the speech. Before that, whoever used to study, they study the history of language. Saussure says, now you study the language which is used by you, and now you study the rules of the language which are active when you use the language. So these are the biggest contribution. And if you want to be part of say literary tradition, like there are structuralist literary tradition, there is post-structuralist literary tradition, and all those things. So you will have to understand Saussure for that matter. Saussure developed many other concepts, but for time being and for the sake of simplicity, I'm talking about only these two to begin with. There is a dichotomy and concept of sign and semiology and synchronic and diachronic and all these things that I'm not going into. It could require one entire lecture for that. So next slide is Chomsky or Chomsky's entry. And there's a big gap between Saussure and Chomsky. Saussure died in 1914 most probably. And Chomsky's first important uh, paper got published in 1956. Chomsky is American linguist, and he is to a large extent following what Saussure did, but he made certain changes, and his idea of the language comes from the very belief that language is innate to all human beings. Now, what does it mean? He believes that there is a universal grammar in our mind. That is, he believes that the rules of the grammar are already there in our mind. They are part of our genetics. It is in our genes. So, if you are born as a human, then you are born with the capacity to use the language. You are born with the capacity to communicate. But if you accept Chomsky's idea that the grammar is already there in our mind, then why we have different grammars for different languages? Because all of us have the similar gene system. Our biology is similar, but our languages are different. The rules of those languages are different. Then how do we negotiate with those two? Okay. So there's a picture of Noam Chomsky. This is a very old picture, around 40 years back. Now he's 95 years old. He keeps beard and now look really, really old. We wait for him to die. So there's a cartoon. You can see that in 1687 in Cambridge, an apple falls on uh, what we call Newton, and he found out a theory. Similarly, in Cambridge in 1957, Chomsky took the analogy of tree and he started working on the grammar in terms of tree, that how tree and grammar are related. Okay. So if you can see here that there is S on the top, which means sentence. There are two branches of S, NP and VP, which means noun phrase and verb phrase. Then there are two branches again, NP. NP has two branches, A and NP. So A is for adjective, colorless, and NP has again two branches, A and noun, that is adjective and noun. And the other branch, VP, again has two branches. V is verb, sleep, and another adv, that is adverb, furiously. So this is how you are making a sentence. So these branches are already there in your mind. This is what Chomsky says. So his theory, he initially started with a cognitive paradigm. That his theory is a cognitive theory. It is related with your understanding. So, but he calls it the generative linguistics because it is about generating sentences. Okay. So, generative grammar is a linguistic theory that regards grammar as a system of rules that generates exactly those combinations of words that form grammatical sentences in given language. A generative grammar gives you only grammatical sentences. And if you follow the rules of grammar, you will give only grammatical sentences. Now, those rules are limited in number, but you can make unlimited sentences with the help of those rules. Noam Chomsky first used the term in relation to the theoretical linguistics of grammar that he developed in the late 1950s. He started this against the behaviorist philosophy, behaviorist psychology. If you remember behaviorism, so there was a very famous book called Verbal Behavior by, I think, Paulo. So Paulo says that language is also like all the other behaviors. You just have to develop a habit of it. No, it was written by B.F. Skinner, not Paulo. So Skinner's idea of behavior, that language is also a type of behavior. So going against his idea of behavior, Chomsky talks about the generative grammar. That no, language is not just a behavior, but it's a kind of rule-based activity, and we have underlying rules. So, two most important contributions for Chomsky is the concept of universal grammar. It is called universal grammar hypothesis. The basic postulate of UG is that a certain set of structural rules are innate to humans. The rules are already there in human mind. Fine. And second thing, very close to Saussure's idea of Lang and Farol, Chomsky talks about competence and performance. So competence is the ideal language system. So for Chomsky also, it is in the mind. It is idealized. All the rules are there that enables speakers to produce and understand an infinite number of sentences in their language and to distinguish grammatical sentences from ungrammatical sentences. Now, Saussure's idea was social, that language is a code and it has social, what we call existence. That all the members of the society that use the language, they have the similar rule. While Chomsky's idea is mental, that these rules are in the mind, not in the society, not in the social people. And the performance is the actual use of the language. There's a cartoon here of Tarzan and Jane. So Tarzan is what we call going to meet Zen, and while passing through one rope to another rope, he's thinking how he will start talking with Zen. So that thinking is his competence, that he has this ability to speak all these things. So the first thought is, okay, how do you do? My name is Tarzan and I believe you are known as Zen. This is his first competence. Second, allow me to introduce myself. I'm Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle, and you? Third one, you must be Zen. I'm Tarzan. It's a pleasure to meet you. So all these is thinking. He has the capacity to speak all these things. But when he actually reaches Jane in front of her and he performs, what does he say? Me Tarzan, you Jane. So this is the actual performance that happens to us also. Like when we think in second language, third language, in our mind, we are so good and we can make the constructions that we have never used. But when we actually speak in front of the people, we perform very few of them. We cannot perform 100% of our knowledge. Okay. So competence is to do with the capacity and performance is the actuality. Fine. Next, I'll give you the example of how Chomsky works. If you see, I've used the same tree diagram here. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Now Chomsky has given this particular uh, sentence to prove one thing. If you read this sentence, what is the meaning of this sentence? Can you tell me? Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Basically, this sentence is grammatical. There is no problem with the grammar in this sentence. Still, this sentence does not make sense because there is something more than grammar. And this is why Chomsky talked about it. That it's not that the grammaticality of the sentence is important. Okay, that there has to be a subject, there has to be a verb, there has to be an object. That is the grammatical aspect. But that subject, verb, and object should also have the internal relationship. Like in this case, if you say idea is something abstract. So it cannot have color, but it is modified with the adjective green. So by rule of the say lexical rule or the meaning of the word, it is contradictory. It doesn't fit. And then you again modify green ideas with colorless. So something which is colorless and green simultaneously is not possible. And another thing, ideas are something abstract, non-human, non-animate, so it cannot sleep. And if someone is sleeping, nobody can sleep furiously. So this sentence is grammatical yet meaningless because the words used in the sentence don't go according to their rules, their requirements. And that's why Chomsky talks about the generative grammar, in which he also talks about the theta roles, that there is a person who is doing the activity. If I say, I eat mango, then I is an agent who is doing the activity. Mango is a patient on which the activity is being done. Both these things are affected in the process of the activity of eating. So such activity cannot be identified here in this sentence, and that's why this sentence doesn't make sense. Now, what generative linguistics does is they give the rules. I've given the rules here. S can be rewritten as NP and VP, that is noun phrase and verb phrase. Now, with the help of only these four rules, you can create thousands of sentences. You can simply change the words, and in place of adjective, you put the adjective, in place of noun, you put the noun, and you can create innumerable generative sentences which are grammatical. And this is third way of uh, creating the phrase. These rules are called phrase structure rules in generative linguistics. And this is the most important thing that has to be done for a generative linguist, to identify the structure of the sentences, and then they try to apply these derived rules on other examples from the same language. If you see here that SNPVP, can you apply that rule on Gujarati? So you have to check, do you have NP, do you have VP? Can you combine them? Then you move to the next rule. NP, noun phrase, can be rewritten as adjective and noun phrase. The bracket means the adjective is optional. It can be there, it may not be there. If you need, you put it. If you don't need, you don't put it. It is not complementary aspect. It is adjunct. But noun phrase must have a noun. It is compulsory. Or verb phrase must have a verb. It is compulsory. Then there is a transitive verb. So in verb phrase, you must have a verb as well as uh, a noun phrase. For example, if I say, I live in Vadodara. So live is the verb which is transitive, which requires an object in Vadodara. So that is, in is a preposition. So it is a prepositional phrase. So it is a requirement of the verb. If you don't put it, then your sentence is incomplete. You say, I live, but where? So this is how generative grammar works. For them, language is innate, it is already there in your mind, and there are rules of the language which are there, which allow you to identify which sentences are grammatical and which sentences are ungrammatical. And being a speaker of that language, you can use the grammatical sentences, and you can create as many sentences as you want with the help of few rules. Next, 6.1, ethnography, ethnographic and anthropological approaches. Now, this is actually one of the oldest traditions, not because many linguists are working in that, but because the anthropologists and the sociologists who are working in the field, they needed to work on the language. So the tradition starts with Bronislaw Malinowski and J.R. Firth, who were anthropologists working in the field. The student of J.R. Firth, Edward Sapir, who was also anthropologist and linguist, and the student of Sapir, uh, Benjamin Lee Whorf. So Sapir and Whorf are very famous in this case. They gave a hypothesis called Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And it is still discussed, still debated. There is no final word on the hypothesis. So many linguists who were concerned with the issues related with language, society, and culture. See, when you look at Chomsky's theory, he just talks about language as something uh, original, automatic. It doesn't have any connection with the society. Chomsky does not talk about the society when he's talking about language. So for him, he talks about ideal speaker hearer who is not constrained by the social norms, who is not constrained by the uh, cultural norms. So there are plenty of linguists who are against the Chomskyan theory primarily because Chomsky did not talk about the society and social influence of the language. So those who are interested here, they uh, come from the background of ethnographic and anthropologists or sociolinguistic, it is called. So how society and culture are influenced by language and how language is influenced by society and culture. That is what the anthropological aspects are. So there are again two branches. There is anthropological linguistics. It is a subfield of linguistics and anthropology who deals with the place of language in its wider social and cultural context. But in the society, what language is and its role in making and maintaining cultural practices. And most of our cultural practices are embedded in language. Let's say if you go to somebody's marriage, it is a cultural practice. So what do you do when you go to somebody's marriage? You talk with the people. Okay. You wear a particular kind of clothes. Okay. So you give message with the clothes that you are wearing. Okay. You don't go in a marriage wearing dull clothes. Or when you go to somebody's funeral, you either wear white clothes or blue clothes. Okay. So this is a cultural practice, and everything that you do in that part of culture, okay, it is symbolic. It has some meaning. Okay. So anthropological linguistics talks about those symbolic meanings and how language is being exploited in that symbolism. On the other hand, linguistic anthropology, very close, is the interdisciplinary study of how language influences social life. It is a branch of anthropology that originated from the endeavor to document endangered languages and has grown over the past century to encompass most aspects of language structure and use. If you have followed the news, almost 90% of languages spoken today are on the verge of death. Now, what is language death? The last native speaker, the person who has acquired the language, not studied the language. The person who has acquired the language dies, the language is dead. It may be recorded. People might have written or people might have made movies on in that language. But that language is no longer spoken like it used to be spoken in the community. So that is called the death of the language. So the people who were concerned about it, they started documenting the languages because they believe that language structure and the vocabulary will also affect how we behave in the society and how we understand different things. For example, I give you one very simple example. In Gujarati, we use there are different words for the types of rain. We say Supadadhar, Sambiladhar, Dabladhar, Nevadhar, and do you remember any other? So why do we use this kind of words? And these words are not used in English to define the intensity of the rain. Okay. So this is where the society and language are related. That your language, we will talk about it later in cognitive paradigm also. The language is based on embodied experience, how we see things, and based on that we understand the things. Okay, and based on that we create the words. Like uh, if your father, say you are a daughter in the family, and if your father says, "Hey, આ તો મારો છોકરો છે," then it is considered a praise, a compliment. But if you are a boy in the family and your father says, "આ મારી છોકરી છે," then it is considered an insult. So why there is a different criteria to judge the similar type of sentence? So it depends on the idea of gender in the given society and how that gender is encoded in your language. Okay. So this is where the linguistic anthropology comes. Next is ethnographic and anthropological approaches. The next, you can see the picture of Dale Hymes. Dale Hymes is one of the most important critics of Chomsky. Dale Hymes was anthropologist and he had developed a theory of ethnography of communication. It is based on the sociological theory of ethnography. In sociology, if you want to do research, one of the tools of research, like you do interviews and all, one of them is ethnographic research. Tudel Himes developed that sociological theory into the linguistic theory, and he made an hierarchy that there is a speech community, the community of the people who use the same variety of the language. Within a speech community, there is a speech situation. Let's say marriage is a speech situation, funeral is a speech situation, birthday party is a speech situation, lecture is a speech situation. A situation which is directly governed by the norms of speaking, how you should communicate in the given situation. Like in marriage, you can crack jokes, you can laugh, but in funeral, you cannot crack jokes. You don't laugh there. So these are the rules that governs the speech situation. And within the speech situation, there are speech events that you go to marriage, you talk to a person for some time, then you go to other place, you talk to another person for some time. So these are the speech events. The speech event can be of 2 lines or 20 lines. It may be small, it may be large. And within speech events, there are speech acts. Every individual utterance, not sentence, utterance, is a speech act. Suppose I say, excuse me. It is not a complete sentence, but it is a speech act. By doing this, I am asking something. So that is why it is speech act. There is another speech act which is very much related, but not same, which we will see in the everyday language philosophy. So Dale Hines, going against the Chomsky's idea of competence and performance, he forwarded the idea of communicative competence. So his idea of communicative competence has 4 rules. First, whether and to what degree something is formally possible. That you have rules of the grammar, but is it possible to execute those rules completely and clearly? Second, whether and to what degree something is feasible. Is it feasible for you to do it? Third, whether and to what degree something is appropriate. Is it appropriate in a given situation? You can say thousands of things, but is it appropriate in a given situation to speak? And whether and to what degree something is in fact done. That is, you've spoken something, there has to be response to it. There has to be a response or feedback. If you tell someone, how are you? What will be the answer to that? You'll say, I'm fine. If you don't get answer, like there is a person who meets you every day, you greet that person every day, you are good friends. Okay. But one day you ask him, how are you? And that person looks at you, listens to you, but does not answer. So that absence of answer is also an answer. That means that the person is not happy with you. There is some problem in your relationship. So all these things are negotiated with the help of the language. If you want to develop a friendship with someone, you don't just go to that person and start talking. There are stages. You first exchange smiles, then you make formal greetings. Hello, how are you? Good morning. If there is positive response to those formal greetings, then you move on to next questions. What are your hobbies? What do you do? And all these things. If there are positive response to that, then you move on to the next question. So gradually you develop your relationship in the given society in with the help of the language. So Delheim says that everything that you are doing in the society is linguistic. It is directly or indirectly governed by the rules of the language. And that's why what Chomsky says that there is ideal speaker here and there are innumerable sentences possible, okay, may be correct at certain level, but at the social level it is not applicable. Because in society, when we communicate, we use a lot of incomplete sentences, ungrammatical sentences, one word answers, and they are all understandable. comprehensible for the other person. So Chomsky's rules of grammar may not be applicable there. And at times, you use completely grammatical sentence, but it is inappropriate. You crack a joke, it is grammatical, but you are in a funeral. People are crying around you and you are cracking a joke. So even if it is grammatical, it is wrong. So grammaticality is not everything in terms of society and culture. There are norms for society and culture and for use of language. So ethnographic and anthropological approaches are looking at those norms. Next is called functional linguistics. Now, for them, language is a tool. We want to, the moment we have a tool, we think about the function of the tool. If you buy a mobile, you think that how will I use a mobile? Similarly, we have a language. Then why do we use the language? What are the functions that we will do with the help of this language? Now, functional theories of grammar are those approaches to study of language that see functionality of language and its elements to be the key to understanding of linguistic processes and structures. Functional theories of language propose that since language is fundamentally a tool, it is reasonable to assume that its structures are best analyzed and understood with reference to the functions they carry out. The functions are more important, and they go with the hypothesis that your grammar is developed in terms of the function. So there are different functional schools. I'm not going into all, but first one, Prague school, they talk about structural functionalism. So they follow Saussure as well as Firth. So functionalism comes from the Firthian aspect of language. Then there is a school led by Andre Martinet who talks about functional syntax. He talks about grammar and sentence structure in terms of function. Then there is a school led by Simon Dick. He talks about functional grammar again. Then there is a school led by Michael Halliday, who talks about systemic functional linguistics. This functionalism and systemic functional linguistics are very important in language teaching. There are a lot of methods which are derived from this functionalist approach to the language. And then there is Robert Van Valen's role and reference grammar. They also talk about functions, roles of the speaker, roles of the subject and object, and how grammar is derived based on those rules. Now, there is an example here from Jakobson. Jakobson was the follower of Prague school, the first one, structural functionalism. So Jakobson divided different functions. You can see here 6 functions are there. Representational function, that is in which context the representation function is directly related with the context in which the language is used. Then message, that how message is created, which is a poetic function. So these people believe that every use of language is a creative use. It is poetic. So it is not an imitation. It is always new. So message is a poetic function. Then context, how, like which medium you are using to convey the message. That context is called phatic function. Then metalingual function, the code that you are using. Say you are using spoken language, you are using written language, you are using sign language. So these are all codes. Then there is a sender. The emotive function is directly associated with the sender. And there is a receiver. Cognitive function is directly associated with the receiver. So they study every text, every instance of the language with the background to this function, that what functions this particular instance of language fulfills. And those who are interested in language teaching, they must study functionalism. Very interesting and very, very helpful in language teaching. The next one, it is called ordinary language philosophy. There is a branch of linguistics called pragmatics, which studies the meaning in context. This branch is directly affected by ordinary language philosophy or everyday language philosophy. So you can see the three pictures. First one with the pipe is J.L. Austin. He developed the notion of speech act, which means we use language not just for communication. In fact, we perform with language. That using language is equivalent to act. For example, in say Christian marriage, when the priest asked, "Will you take this woman as your legal wife?" The groom has to reply very specific answer. He will say, "Yes, I do." By saying this, he is accepting that woman as his wife. This is an act. Okay. In the end, the priest declares that I hereby declare you man and wife. So it is not just a sentence, it is an activity. By saying this, he has made a couple, he has completed a marriage ceremony. Same thing happens when a priest, a pandit, recites the slokas during our marriage or in funerals and in all the religious activities. So we are not just listening to that language. We are actually complying to that act. He is doing something and we follow his orders through the language. And we use that every day. It's not that those pandits are capable of using language as an action. When you say someone, excuse me, you're not using language, you are doing an action. You are asking somebody to move. So by using specific kind of language. So here, what is interesting is, they are moving two steps ahead. First, they are going against the logical positivism because they believe that every sentence has to be true or false. There has to be truth value. When I say I hereby declare you man and wife, it cannot be true or false. It could be appropriate or inappropriate. Fine. So they have denounced the very idea of logical positivism. Second, they're going against the Chomskyan grammar, generative grammar. So Chomsky said that there is grammar and you use language because of this kind of grammatically and you are capable of using the grammar. But no, we use language communication. So communication is not about the grammaticality or just function. It's also about the intention. We want to do something with the help of that language, but we don't use it literally. We don't say it literally for various reasons. These are all, again, social reasons, contextual reasons. And the last one, Paul Grice, his most influential contribution to philosophy and linguistics is the theory of implicature. An implicature is something the speaker suggests or implies with an utterance, even though it is not literally expressed. That we speak something, but we mean something. So that means that we are creating an implicature. And we need to understand why those implicatures are created. What are the constraints because of which the speaker is not using the language literally? So these three have influenced the beginning of a new school called pragmatics. They are also influenced by the ideas of Wittgenstein and William James. So ordinary language philosophy is a branch of linguistic philosophy closely related to logical positivism. It is a philosophical methodology that sees traditional philosophical problems as rooted in misunderstanding philosophers, developed by distorting or forgetting what words actually mean in everyday use. So we don't normally use what words really mean. We use its metaphorical meaning. We use or we create another meaning with the help of those words. Okay. Next one is cognitive paradigm. This is also a new field developed somewhere in 1970s, and these are the two most important names in the cognitive paradigm. The first one, George Lakoff, and the second one, Roland Langekar. Now, cognitive linguistics, and they are also influenced by anthropological research. The cognitive linguistics, as the scholars like Lakoff and Langekar label their work, is a paradigm emerged against the Chomskyan generative paradigm. This is very important. Chomskyan generative paradigm. Again, the question of grammaticality and use of language. So do we really use literal language as suggested by Chomsky's grammar? These people deny that no, we never use the literal language. In fact, one of the hypotheses in cognitive paradigm is that our language is literary, our mind is literary. So we understand things better if it is conveyed in the form of story. So we never use language in a literal sense, in literal meaning. We always use in a metaphorical, lyrical, poetic way. So they give explanation of linguistic phenomena via general cognitive mechanism. That how we understand, how we see the things. Here, meaning is the motive for language and is embodied in physical experience. As I said earlier, that how you see things physically, how you touch things, how you experience things, those things are considered more important in generating the meaning. For example, if I put this mobile on the table, I will say the mobile is on the table. I will never say the table is under the mobile. What is the difference? They represent the same reality, same objective reality. But in our experience, table is bigger. So we tend to put it as a platform. Like right now we say we are having a lecture on Skype. Why don't we say we are having a lecture in Skype? So we are using Skype as a platform. We use the metaphor of platform. And if there is a platform, we always use on. If we use the metaphor of room, then we use in, like there was Yahoo rooms, chat rooms in Yahoo. So we used to say, come in this room. So there we use in room, not on room. So this is based on our experience. So, and when we sit on the table or stool, we say, I'm sitting on the stool. But when we sit on what we call a chair, a big chair, with the handles both the sides, then we say, I'm sitting in the chair. Because it is surrounded by three sides. The stool is open. So our experience will differ. Here, empirical analysis of authentic linguistic data is done. You collect the data, how it is used, not the hypothetical data. Chomskyan grammar is based on hypothetical data. So these are the possible grammatical sentences, and we derive the rules from that. These people get empirical data, real data that people are using. Language is a way of expressing speakers' concepts of the world. How you see the world, what is your understanding of the world, is reflected in the language. That's why I say that when you say, this amaro chokro che and amari chokri che, one is considered a compliment and another is considered an insult, because our view of the world is different. This is where there is a difference in the meaning lies. Language is acquired and contextual. They say that language is acquired by the student, by the person, by the subject, and it is always contextual. You cannot talk about the contextual language, and even acquisition happens in contextual form. You cannot acquire a language if you are exposed to the language through the medium of TV or radio, but there is no one to talk to you. It has to be contextual because you should be actively using language to do something. There and only then you will have the experience. Otherwise, you will be passive. There will be no first-hand experience. And the last one integrationism, which is also called integrational linguistics. And the most important name here is Roy Harris. Roy Harris is also a scholar of Sanskrit and Buddhist philosophy, and his book on integrationalism, primarily his small book, basically he delivered 4 lectures at Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla. Those 4 lectures are collected and published by IIS. It is called History, Science and Limits of Language. In those 4 lectures, he destroyed the entire Western tradition of philosophy, and he come up with something completely new. Now his argument is that everything that we are doing in linguistics is wrong. Why? Because we are trying to identify the rules of language. But language is not primary. Language is secondary. Primary is the communication. You have language because you want to communicate. You don't communicate because you have language. Suppose there are 4 people in the room, all of them know 4 or 5 languages, and they understand each other, but they don't want to talk to each other. They don't want to communicate. And all the languages that they know are useless. But suppose there are 4 people in the room and they don't know any of the common language, but they want to communicate. Then they will develop a code to communicate. So language emerges as a requirement of communication. Language is not there. So what Harris suggests is we will have to study communication, or even if we study language, we will have to study language in completely integrated form in terms of communication, society, speaker, hearer, time, all the dimensions will have to be taken care of. So it is an approach in the theory of communication that emphasizes innovative participants by communicators within context and rejects rule-based model of grammar. There has to be rule-based model of communication, not of grammar. They are essentially followers of Saussure. Roy Harris is one of the few people who has translated Saussure from French to English and provide a new interpretation of Saussure's theory of language. They believe that yes, Saussure was structuralist, but at the same time, Saussure was also integrationalist. Saussure also incorporated all the other aspects of the things like social, cultural, communicative aspect, speaker, hearer, everything, in order to talk about his theory. But people did not consider those important points, and that's why they are reinterpreting Saussure. He's written a very interesting book called Interpreting Saussure. Now, interpreters of Saussure. So he has written chapters on one chapter on Chomsky, one on Derrida, one on Roland Barthes, but how they have interpreted Saussure for their own purposes. And all of them have different interpretations. Then they do not distinguish between language and communication. There is no language beyond communication. If you cannot communicate with it, it is not a language. So communication is primary for them. They take inspiration and base their research in the works of Saussure, Peirce, Malinowski, Wittgenstein, Garfinkel, Firth, Austin, Ryle. So majority of them are anthropologists, then the everyday language philosophers, and the Saussure is there. So their theory of language is not essentially a theory of language. And they have developed a model completely based on communication. He uses one very important dictum from Arjuna's philosophy, that you cannot touch the same river again. And he is using this analogy for language. That even if you are using the same sentence again, after some time, it is not the same sentence anymore. because your time and space are different. Right? So these are the 10 schools of linguistics. There are few others, smaller branches, which I'm not going into. I would like to go for the questions. Please ask questions because I'm unable to read the chat. I don't know how to do it. This is first time I'm using this on mobile. May I have questions, please? Is something?
Sir, I have one question. Am I audible?
Your voice is cutting.
Uh, Hello.
Yeah.
Sir, am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Uh, Sir, I'm teaching English language teaching in masters. So many a times I find this problem that when we are teaching theory or linguistics, the concept is clear, but when the students have to actually communicate and use the practical language in usage, they find lots of problems. So, how to deal with this?
See, it, like having knowledge of something, if we use the
Yeah.
language of Chomsky, that there is a competence. They have the rules in their mind, but performance is affected by outer factors. Having rules are not enough.
Okay.
You
Hmm.
need, like, there is something called people are afraid of speaking in public. This is one
Hmm.
aspect. Then there are some people who are ashamed of it. There are some people who do not have enough vocabulary. Okay. Because when you are speaking, you have to make use of those rules in a very minimal part of a second. Because
Okay.
you first, like, whenever the second language speaker using the language initially, initial stage, they first prepare the sentence in their mind, or probably they
Hmm.
prepare the sentence in their mother tongue, then they translate the sentence into the second language, and then they try to speak. So it is a long process. It doesn't happen very easily. So for that
Yeah.
matter, the practice is enough. And
Hmm.
practice in terms of real language use, not the
Yeah.
simulated language use. Like you give them some dialogue, they prepare the dialogue and then they practice. Okay. They help to some extent in overcoming the fear,
Hmm.
but it will not help in using the rules of the language effectively. For that, you require practice and you have to speak.
Thank you, sir.
It is like driving. Okay, how many of you are drivers? We know all the rules of driving.
Hmm.
We know all the rules of traffic. But when you actually go onto the road, okay, you just don't have to depend on your rules. You also have to depend on the rules that the other person knows.
Hmm.
Communication is a two-way process. And the way other person behaves, you will have to negotiate your rules and execute your performance. So the more you practice, the better driver you will become. Same thing happens with the language. The more you practice, the better performer you will become. But as a teacher, uh, our job is to allow them freedom to speak and
Hmm.
jot down the mistakes that they are making and make them aware about the mistakes afterwards. Once they
Hmm.
finish their communication, it is better to inform them after. Because when you say interrupt and talk about their mistakes, they will lose the confidence.
Yes.
So allow them to speak once and then make point that these are the problems. You'll have to work on this problem. Basically, it's a problem of performance. Basically, communicative competence, what Haim says, is not just about execution of rules, but about how the language should be used in the given context, in the given society, with the given person. So here, the social rules are also involved. Like many people, when they are talking about their seniors or their teachers, instead of using he, they use they, which is the basic translation of our Gujarati practice, that we call our seniors or teachers with a bigger pronoun. So same thing is translated in English also, though they are talking about a singular person. So our job as a teacher is to let them move from this translation stage to the creation stage. They should not translate their mother tongue into English. They should create a structure in the English. If that can happen, they will get more confidence.
Thank you, sir.
Any other question? I've skipped a lot of things because of the time duration and the technical issues. As I once told Alpha, that technology is like a boyfriend. It can betray you a lot many ways. My laptop is not running Zoom, Skype, or even Twitter. I don't know what has happened. Okay, any more questions, please?
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Am I audible clearly?
Yeah, you are.
Sir, I don't have a question, but I would like to request you to throw some light on the point, which, as students, we have studied so far that language is unstable. Derridian concept of language, particularly, and it keep its meaning postponing as soon as we try to reach the meaning, and as per his argument, he says that we never get a particular meaning from text or language. So would you like to elaborate this point, please?
See, what I talked about the Roy Harris's argument, you cannot touch the same river again. Okay, and he's using this analogy for language. That is, if we go by the analogy, the river is something which is in the state of flow. It is moving. Okay, so you touch that water, and after some time, let's say after 2 minutes, you touch that water again, but the water that you have touched before 2 minutes was different because it is flowing, it is moving ahead. So now what you are touching is a new water. Similar thing is happening in the language. You are using one particular sentence structure. You are a speaker, somebody else is the what we call interpreter. There is a context in which you have spoken. Your context is based on your knowledge of the world and language. The interpreter's interpretation is based on his or her knowledge of the world and the language. And second thing is that language and language users are creative aspect. Okay? That we never use language literally. We don't look into the dictionary to give meaning to something. Okay, so like according to Chomsky and paradigm, if I say I eat mango, it is a right sentence. But if I say he eats mango, and if I say he eats my head, okay, we use this statement, he eats my head. But according to Chomsky paradigm, it is wrong. Okay, because grammatically it is correct, but the verb eat requires something edible, and head is not something edible. But what we as a speaker do is we extend the meaning. We want to convey something beyond the literal meaning. Okay. So when you are looking or interpreting of the text, okay, we talk about that non-literal aspect. But then it has to be encoded in a particular way. Okay. I gave you the example of this, he is my son, he is my daughter kind of thing. What happens in Gujarati is, uh, in Gujarati, feminine gender is used as diminutive. Diminutive means you want to make something smaller. Okay. So what happens? We say in Gujarati, ordo. A big room is ordo. A small room is ordi. So ordo is masculine, ordi is feminine. And whenever you want to make something smaller, you either use feminine or neutral gender. So now when you borrow a word from some other language, let's say a word like baby, we borrowed this word in English from English in Gujarati. In English, the word baby has a very clear meaning. It's a neutral word. It can be used for both boy and girl. You can specify baby boy, baby girl. But when we borrowed this word in Gujarati, this word comes with E, which is the feminine gender marker in Gujarati language. So we people reinterpreted the word, that the word is baba and E is added for feminine. So in Gujarati now we use it for female child, girl child. Now we don't stop there, we are creative people. So we created another word using masculine gender, and we say babo. So the original meaning of the word was something different. We borrowed it, we changed it, and now we are using it in a different way. There is babu and there is baby. And there is neutral gender babu, which is completely different. Okay. So now what is happening, that what is your experience being an interpreter? If you do not have that word in your lexicon, if you do not have that level of interpretation in your experience, you tend to derive your experience based on the context. Who is saying, where that person is saying this, in which context, like what is spoken before it, what is spoken after it. All these things are important. Plus, there are social rules. For example, if I ask you, how do you do? Now, if this statement, if someone asks me this thing in Britain, and if I say I'm fine, we do that here in India very often. But in Britain, if you say I'm fine, then that person will not talk to you again. Because the true answer of how do you do is how do you do. So in this case, what is happening, that the rules of the society, that how to use the language is important in interpretation. Something is happening when you ask someone Kemcho. If you ask someone Kemcho, what expectation you have as an answer? We simply reply, Kemcho is replied as Majama, right? But even if that person is not well, you visit that person in a hospital, you go there and ask Kemcho. So if that person doesn't say Majama, then he will say better. Pehla karta saru chhe. But that person will not tell you everything that he's suffering from, because you are not asking for that reason. So interpretation is dependent on so many things. So we will have to understand that what are the things that we will have to consider in interpreting. So this is where the pragmatics will help you. The intentionality, why the speaker is speaking this, for what reason. So these things are important in interpretation. I hope it is making some sense.
Yes, sir.
Does it answer your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Any other question, please?
Sir, there is one question from Miss Alpa, and
Okay.
I would like to repeat that because her voice is cracking.
Okay.
The question is, if we see this word absurd
Hmm.
and we see its meaning in Gujarati, we will have words like vahiyat, visangatata, etc.
Hmm.
In a way, it cannot satisfy us when we try to imagine that word in another language, here in
Hmm.
Gujarati and in
Hmm.
English. That's
True.
it.
So the thing is, there are certain things which are specific to given society and culture. Like if you try to translate something, you will realize this problem. Absurd is something developed in some other part of the world, and we have a very different understanding of it. Primarily because we haven't seen absurd as a literary term. In day-to-day language, absurd is used uh, in terms of something which is completely illogical. Okay, so you talk about absurd. We are not talking in terms of literary tradition there. While absurdism in other parts of the world, especially in western part of the world, is a well-developed concept. It is not developed here. So that's one of the reasons that mm, the translation is very difficult task to do. It's not just the question of absurd. There are plenty of such words which we cannot translate, giving the full significance of the original word. And second thing is the functionality of that word. It is not very much functional for us in our context. And that's why we tend to change it in a different way. When I was young, like in 7th standard, there was a word very popular among uh, our area in Pavijatpur, Chota area. It was called Abar and nobody knows the actual meaning of that word. But everybody used to use that word in terms of absurd. Now, and today nobody is using that word. That word is not listed in any dictionary. That word was there at that time. Now it's not there. So there is a time dimension, there is a social dimension, there is a place dimension, there is a cultural dimension, functionality, everything is involved when you talk about language. So basically it is said that in language there are only loopholes. Okay. There is nothing concrete. And primarily because it is dynamic, it is changing and it will change. That's why all these problems of interpretations are there. Is it making sense?
Yes, sir, completely.
Any more question? Okay. Any more question, please? So those who want to stay in literary studies, you should study structural linguistics. Okay. Those who want to stay in language teaching, they should go to the functional linguistics and ethnographic linguistics because these are the theories which are used very frequently in linguistic and ELT aspects. In ELT, we talk about three levels. That is uh, method, approach, and technique. So when you are talking about approach, this is where the language comes. That what is your understanding of language? And based on that understanding, you develop a method and you use a particular technique. If you think that language is behavior, okay, like what happened in audiolingual method, they believe that language is nothing but behavior and they followed the behaviorism, and there were a lot of practice of the structures. So they believe that the more you practice, the more you remember. So they memorize everything and they practice. On the other hand, there is communicative language teaching, who talked about the communicative aspect using ethnography. So they have a very different approach. They don't teach the rules of the grammar directly. They rather ask you to use the language to communicate, and the rules will be emerging, and the teacher is a kind of facilitator. Teacher won't teach you the rules. So these approaches will affect your practice in the language teaching classroom directly. Any other thing? There are school branches like stylistics, who studies literature from the perspective of linguistics. There is a branch called computational linguistics, who talk about machine translation and machines learning languages. It is part of artificial intelligence, but again, you require linguistic rules there, and because of which Chomsky is still famous, because his rules are very much applicable in computational linguistics. So anything else you want to ask? You have any doubt? Any more clarification? I'm waiting.
Sir, I guess there isn't any.
Yeah, sure.
And sir, sincere apology on behalf of the entire organizing team for today's technical errors.
I think it's because of me that all of us has to suffer. My laptop is not recognizing the sites like Twitter and Zoom and Skype, and it says that there is no problem in my laptop, but there is some problem in the original website. How is it possible? I don't know, but it's working on the mobile. Skype is working with list.
Yes,
So again, it is subjective.
yeah. And on behalf of us also, sir, in our part also there are some errors which we have made today. And sir, we would like to hear you again, or if you plan out a session on corpus linguistics, would that be fine with you?
I don't have direct what we call any connection with corpus linguistics. I'll have to first check. So once I go through and learn from someone, because I know linguistics, but corpus part I'll have to do. I am planning to do it, but I'll inform you if I could, or I'll inform some other scholar who can do in corpus linguistics. One of my student is working in Bangalore with this AI company, who is working in computational corpus aspect. So I'll ask him if he's free, he can conduct a session. So I'll also learn.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your patience.